My jealous brother threw a wine glass on my head at my 25th birthday party in front of all the guests. My parents laughed at his act. Humiliated, I left the event and returned home, but when they arrived, a huge shocking surprise awaited them. I still remember my 25th birthday as if it happened yesterday, even though years have passed. It was supposed to be a celebration, a small gathering at a restaurant in Brooklyn where my family and I could sit together, share a meal, and enjoy one another's company. Instead, it became the night that changed everything for me. I had walked into that restaurant with a sense of hope. I wasn't expecting a grand party, just a chance to feel loved and supported on a milestone birthday. The tables were decorated simply, the lights dim but warm, and the smell of roasted food drifted out from the kitchen. I sat with my parents, Richard and Linda, and my older brother, David. Richard, my father, had retired a couple of years earlier from his job as an accountant, and Linda, my mother, kept herself busy with homemaking and small church groups. My brother David was 28 at the time. He worked in the food business, moving from one kitchen to another, always talking about the restaurant he would one day own, though nothing ever seemed to last. David had a habit of competing with me, even when I wasn't trying to compete. If I shared good news, he would cut it down. If I bought something nice for myself, he would find a way to make me feel guilty. For as long as I can remember, he carried a kind of jealousy that hung between us. It wasn't a playful sibling rivalry that fades as you grow up. It was heavier, more bitter, as if every small piece of happiness I found somehow stole something from him. That night, as we sat together, I tried to ignore the sharpness in his eyes. I smiled when the waiter brought out a bottle of champagne, thinking maybe this would be the one time he let things be easy. But David had other plans. Without warning, he lifted his glass, smirked at me, and then, almost in slow motion, he threw the champagne glass over my head. The cold liquid spilled down my hair, soaked into my dress, and dripped onto the floor beneath my chair. Gasps filled the room from nearby tables, but the sound that cut through me wasn't theirs. It was his laughter. He leaned back, grinning at his own cruelty, and then said, "You'll never be more than a joke." I froze in my chair, humiliated. My face burned with heat, my hands shook in my lap, and for a moment I thought surely someone would speak up. Surely my parents would say something, tell him he had gone too far, defend me. But when I turned to them, hoping for a sign of comfort, I saw something that hurt more than the champagne dripping from my chin. They were laughing. My father chuckled and shook his head as if David's behavior was some kind of harmless prank. My mother covered her mouth, trying to hide her smile, but the glimmer of amusement was there. In that moment, I realized I was alone. Not just in the restaurant, but in the larger sense that the people I expected to defend me would not. The betrayal stung sharper than the embarrassment itself. I excused myself quietly, my voice barely working, and I walked out into the cold night air of Brooklyn. My dress clung to me, sticky and damp, and my legs trembled as I tried to hold myself upright. I made it home, but once inside I broke down. I shook uncontrollably, my tears mixing with the champagne still in my hair, and I felt small in a way I hadn't since I was a child. That night, something inside me cracked. It wasn't just the cruelty of what David had done. It was the way my parents had chosen to laugh instead of protect me. The people who were supposed to be my shield had turned into spectators. I told myself then that I could not depend on them for my worth, my confidence, or my future. The days that followed were hard. I carried the weight of humiliation like a shadow that followed me everywhere. At work, I found myself second-guessing every decision, replaying that moment in the restaurant, hearing his voice again and again. "You'll never be more than a joke." But slowly, that same voice started to light a fire in me. If that was what he believed, then I would prove him wrong. Not to him, not to my parents, but to myself. I started working longer hours, taking on projects that others avoided, and pushing myself to learn skills outside of my comfort zone. I saved every dollar I could, cutting back on small luxuries, watching as my account grew bit by bit. I began studying investments, reading books late into the night, and meeting with mentors who guided me. It was exhausting, but every time I thought about quitting, I saw David's face, laughing at me with that cruel smirk. It gave me just enough anger to keep moving. Years passed like this, one determined step after another. By my early 30s, I had built something real, my own company. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of nights I thought I would collapse from the pressure. But little by little, I became stronger, sharper, and more confident. Success didn't erase the memory of that birthday, but it transformed it. The same moment that nearly broke me became the foundation I stood on. Meanwhile, David's life took a different turn. He chased his dream of running a restaurant, opening one in Manhattan, but his habits dragged him down. He spent too freely, refused to listen to advice, and pushed away good people. His arrogance made it impossible for him to admit when he was wrong, and his jealousy toward others only grew. The restaurant started strong but slowly began to fail, like every other project he had touched. I heard about his struggles through my parents, who always painted him as unlucky rather than reckless. They never spoke of his cruelty to me, as if that night in Brooklyn had been wiped from their memories. But I hadn't forgotten. And when the day came that David called me directly, asking for help, I listened carefully. His voice was lower than I remembered, almost tired, as he told me about his debts and his last chance at a grand reopening. I said yes. Not because I forgave him, not because I wanted to see him succeed, but because I felt the weight of something larger settling into place. The same brother who had humiliated me in front of my family was now asking for my help to save his dream. And I, the sister he had mocked as nothing more than a joke, was the only one who could give it. I agreed to invest, and he took my answer as a sign of truce. He thought maybe old wounds had healed. He believed I would stand quietly at his side while he tried to rebuild his image. He didn't know me as well as he thought. Because deep down, I knew this story wasn't finished yet. When I agreed to help David, I knew exactly what I was doing. He thought I was extending a hand out of kindness, maybe even guilt, but I wasn't. I kept my voice steady on the phone when I told him yes, acting calm, almost casual, as if it didn't matter to me. Inside, though, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. The power had shifted, and he didn't even realize it. After that call, David began to include me in his plans. He spoke with the same overconfidence he had always carried, bragging about how this reopening would put him on the map. He told me about the new chef he had hired, the renovations he wanted, and the long guest list he was building that included reporters and food critics. He never once said thank you. To him, my money wasn't help, it was just a tool he believed he deserved. He treated me the way he always had, with arrogance and superiority, as if nothing had changed between us. But everything had changed. I sat in his restaurant more than once during those weeks leading up to the reopening. I watched him snap at waiters, roll his eyes at the chef, and brag to anyone who would listen. He carried himself like a man who had already won, blind to the cracks forming all around him. I noticed the unpaid bills piling up on his desk. I overheard vendors asking for money he didn't have. He ignored the signs because he thought I would carry him through. One afternoon, I sat across from him at a corner table while he scribbled ideas on a notepad. He barely looked at me, but he kept talking. "You'll see, Sarah," he said. "This place is going to be legendary. People will write about it, and I'll finally get the recognition I deserve. And when they ask how I pulled it off, I'll say it was all me." I didn't respond. I just nodded, biting back the words I wanted to say. He still couldn't stand to share even a sliver of credit. Deep down, he still needed me, but he would never admit it. That jealousy he had carried since we were kids was still there, poisoning every part of him. He could not see me as anything other than competition, even when I was the one keeping his dream alive. I went home that night and sat at my desk, staring at the investment papers in front of me. My signature had given him hope, but I knew what I would eventually do. Part of me wondered if it was too cruel, if pulling my support would destroy him completely. But then I remembered the champagne dripping down my face, the sound of my parents' laughter, the way my hands had shaken as I left the restaurant on my birthday. That memory hardened me. It wasn't cruelty. It was justice. Still, I had to be patient. Timing was everything. If I pulled away too soon, He would find another backer, or he might scale down his plans. No, it had to be at the peak of his confidence, when the spotlight was on him, when the audience was watching. Only then would the fall mean something. The weeks leading up to the reopening stretched out slowly. I kept my distance, but showed just enough interest to keep him confident. Our parents, Richard and Linda, spoke about David with pride whenever they called me. "He's finally found his path," my father said. "He's lucky to have you in his corner," my mother added. I listened without correcting them, letting them believe I was simply the supportive daughter and sister. They never once asked how I was doing. It was always about David. It had always been about David. The night before the reopening, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had led me here. I thought about the humiliation I had carried, the years of hard work that followed, the rise of my company, and the endless struggle to prove myself. I thought about the phone call when David had asked for help, his voice tinged with desperation but still dripping with arrogance. I thought about the way my parents had laughed on my birthday and how that laughter had never really stopped echoing in my mind. Tomorrow was not just about David's restaurant. It was about all of it, the years of silence, the years of pain, and the years of being treated like I was less. When morning came, I dressed carefully. I chose a simple black dress, nothing flashy, but elegant enough to stand out. I wanted to look calm and composed, untouchable. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't the same girl who had walked out of a restaurant in Brooklyn at 25 with champagne dripping down her dress. She was someone who had built herself from the ground up, someone who had survived betrayal and turned it into strength. I arrived at the restaurant that evening just before the guests began to pour in. The place looked polished, with fresh paint on the walls, new lighting, and tables set with care. Reporters shuffled in with notepads, photographers snapped pictures, and the energy in the room buzzed with anticipation. My parents were already seated near the front, beaming with pride as they spoke to other guests about David's big night. I stood in the back for a while, watching, unnoticed, letting it all soak in. David moved through the crowd like he owned the world. He shook hands, laughed loudly, and spoke with the confidence of someone who believed nothing could go wrong. When he finally saw me, he gave me a quick nod, as if I were just another guest. He didn't thank me. He didn't acknowledge what I had done to make the night possible. That was David, always blind to anything that didn't serve his pride. The speeches began, the lights dimmed, and the attention turned to him. David stood on the small stage at the front, talking about his vision, his passion, his hard work. He made no mention of me, no mention of the help he had begged for. To the crowd, he was the self-made man, the dreamer who had turned everything around. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. And as I listened, my heart pounded with a mixture of anger and anticipation. The moment was coming, and I knew it would change everything. Because I hadn't forgotten what he did to me. I hadn't forgotten how he laughed, how my parents joined in, how I walked home shaking and broken. Tonight was not just his reopening. Tonight was my chance to take back the power he had stolen from me. I waited for the right time, knowing the fall had to happen when his pride was at its highest. And as I looked at his smug smile under the stage lights, I knew the moment was almost here. The air inside the restaurant that night felt heavy, almost electric. Everyone was waiting for David's grand moment, and he soaked it up with a grin that stretched across his face. I sat at my table, pretending to be just another guest, but inside my chest, my heart was beating with a rhythm that matched the tension in the room. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind so many times, and now it was finally here. David walked around like he was already a star. He shook hands with reporters, laughed loudly with critics, and leaned in close to tell stories about how hard he had worked to build this place. Every word he spoke was soaked in pride, but not once did he mention me. It didn't surprise me. He had never been able to admit that I mattered. I watched my parents from across the room. Richard and Linda were glowing, their faces bright with joy as they told anyone who would listen how proud they were of their son. My father patted David's back when he passed by, and my mother kissed his cheek. For them, This night was proof that he was finally becoming the man they always wanted him to be. Not once did they look my way. To them, I was invisible, the quiet daughter who had done well for herself, but never needed the spotlight. The waiters moved swiftly through the room, pouring wine, serving appetizers, and clearing plates. Guests chatted, their voices rising and falling like music in the background. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, and the whole place buzzed with energy. David climbed onto the small stage near the front, holding a microphone in his hand, and the room quieted. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice smooth and confident. "This is the start of something incredible. This restaurant is more than just food. It's a dream come true. I've worked hard, I've sacrificed, and I've pushed through every challenge to make this night possible." His words cut through me like glass. He made it sound as though he had carried everything on his own, as though my investment, my trust, my silent presence meant nothing. He looked out at the crowd with pride, taking in the applause, his chest rising like a man who had conquered the world. But I knew the truth. And I knew what I was about to do. The timing had to be perfect. If I pulled out too soon, the impact wouldn't be strong enough. But if I waited until the peak of the evening, when the press was fully watching and the guests were settled into their seats, the shock would be unforgettable. I wanted David to feel what I had felt years ago on my birthday, the sting of humiliation, the collapse of trust, the sudden shift from pride to shame. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 8. The main course was about to be served, and the energy in the room was at its highest. I excused myself from the table quietly and walked toward the back office where David kept his contracts and financial papers. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, but no one noticed me slipping away. Inside the office, I sat at the desk and opened the folder that held my agreements. My name was written clearly across the papers, my signature at the bottom, binding me to this investment. My hand didn't shake as I reached for the pen. I had waited years for this moment, and now that it was here, I felt calm. I drew a line through the page, clear and sharp, and signed the withdrawal notice. By the time I walked back into the main room, the servers had begun bringing out plates of food. The smell of roasted lamb and fresh herbs filled the air, and guests clapped as the dishes were set in front of them. David walked from table to table, smiling proudly, completely unaware of what was coming. I caught the manager's eye and handed him the notice. He looked confused at first, then his face paled as he realized what it meant. Without my funding, the restaurant couldn't cover the cost of the night. The lights, the food, the staff, it was all riding on the promise of my investment. I nodded once, firm and certain, and he understood. Within minutes, the first signs of collapse began. The music cut out suddenly, the hum of the kitchen went silent, and then the lights flickered before shutting down completely. A wave of confusion spread through the guests. Some whispered, others laughed nervously, thinking it was a minor technical problem. But then the staff began to panic, whispering to one another, rushing back and forth without direction. Plates of food were abandoned half-served, wine glasses left empty. David's voice rose above the noise. "What's going on?" he shouted, striding toward the kitchen. I stayed in my seat, calm, watching. His face shifted from irritation to panic as the manager pulled him aside and explained in a low voice. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I saw it in David's eyes, the disbelief, the anger, the sudden recognition that everything was falling apart. Reporters began scribbling furiously, cameras flashing to capture the chaos. Guests stood from their tables, some demanding answers, others shaking their heads in disappointment. My parents rose slowly, confusion etched on their faces, their joy slipping away as they realized something was terribly wrong. And then David looked at me. His eyes locked onto mine across the room, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look smug or arrogant. He looked small. His mouth opened, but no words came. His face twisted, his pride crumbling in front of everyone, and in that moment, I saw the same humiliation I had once carried. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held his gaze, letting him feel the weight of it. The collapse was his, not mine. The humiliation was his, not mine. And the look on his face, the shock, the pain, the realization, was the gift I had been waiting for. Guests began filing out, muttering to each other about the disaster. Reporters whispered excitedly, already drafting headlines in their minds. The staff stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. My parents tried to comfort David, but he pushed them away, his pride too broken to accept their touch. I rose from my seat and walked toward the door, my steps slow and steady. The air outside was cool, the city alive with noise and movement. Behind me, the restaurant crumbled into silence, its grand reopening turned into ashes in a single night. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not because I had destroyed him, but because I had finally closed the circle. The humiliation that had once defined me no longer held me down. I had faced it, and I had taken my power back. But even as I stood there on the sidewalk, breathing in the night air, I knew this wasn't the end. Revenge, no matter how sweet, never truly ends with one act. It lingers, it echoes, and it leaves behind a silence that asks, what comes next? And that question, heavy and sharp, followed me into the night. After that night, everything changed. Not just for David, but for me as well. I walked away from the restaurant without looking back, yet the image of his face, frozen in shock, the arrogance drained from him, stayed with me. For years, I had carried the memory of him throwing that champagne glass over my head, my parents' laughter echoing like a cruel soundtrack behind it. That pain had driven me, shaped me, and guided every step I took. Now, standing in the aftermath of his collapse, I finally felt like I had answered it. But the days that followed were not as simple as I imagined. David tried to call me, his number flashing across my phone again and again. Sometimes he left voicemails, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. You ruined me, Sarah. You think this makes you better than me? Other times, his tone softened, almost pleading. Please, we can fix this. Just give me another chance. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My silence was my answer, stronger than any words I could give him. My parents, of course, were furious. Richard called me one evening, his voice tight with disappointment. How could you do that to your brother? He asked. Do you have any idea how humiliated he was? That was your own family you embarrassed. Linda chimed in the next day, saying, David was under so much pressure. You should have supported him. Families forgive, Sarah. That's what we do. I listened quietly, letting their words wash over me. But I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of my 25th birthday, of the way they laughed as champagne dripped down my dress. I didn't explain that their silence had spoken louder than words back then, and now my silence was the only answer I could give. In truth, I wasn't sure how I felt. Part of me felt satisfied, as if I had finally balanced the scales. For years, David had mocked me, belittled me, and tried to break me down. My parents had chosen to laugh with him instead of standing by me. That night in the restaurant had been the moment where all of that came crashing back onto him, where he was forced to taste the humiliation he had fed me. But another part of me felt hollow. Revenge fills you for a moment, but it doesn't last. What lingers is the silence afterward, the emptiness of knowing you've ended something you can't take back. I thought often about resilience, about how pain had shaped me. It was true, I had turned that humiliation into strength. Without it, maybe I never would have pushed myself so hard. Maybe I never would have built my company or learned to stand alone. The cruelty that once crushed me had been the same fuel that kept me alive. But there was also a cost. Resilience comes with scars, and mine would never truly fade. I saw David once more after that night. Months had passed, and I ran into him on the street near Union Square. He looked thinner, older somehow, as if the weight of failure had settled into his skin. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I thought he might yell, or sneer, or try to wound me again. Instead, he just looked tired. He muttered my name, Sarah, as if it carried both accusation and surrender, then turned away. I stood there watching him walk off, realizing that he wasn't the brother I had grown up with anymore. He wasn't even the same man who had thrown champagne over my head years earlier. He was something smaller, diminished, broken in a way I could no longer recognize. After that, I stopped waiting for closure. I knew I would never hear an apology, not from him and not from my parents. They weren't built to admit their cruelty, to acknowledge the pain they had caused. And maybe that was for the best. Because if I had waited for their words, I might still be waiting today. Instead, I gave myself what I needed: distance, silence, and the knowledge that I had survived. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that birthday. The feel of the champagne dripping down my skin, the burn of humiliation in my chest, the sound of their laughter. And then I think about the reopening. The way the lights went out, the silence that fell over the room, the way David's face collapsed in front of everyone. Both memories live side by side in me, like two bookends holding up everything that happened in between. One was the moment I broke, and the other was the moment I took myself back. People often talk about forgiveness, about how it frees you. I'm not sure if I believe that. Maybe one day I'll forgive David, but I don't feel the need to rush toward it. What I know is this: cruelty has a way of circling back. The pain you give to others doesn't disappear. It waits, it lingers, and one day it returns. David's jealousy poisoned our family, and his cruelty tried to break me. But in the end, it broke him instead. As for me, I kept moving forward. My company continued to grow. My work kept me grounded, and I found peace in building a life that was mine alone. I no longer sought approval from my parents, nor did I wait for David to acknowledge me. I stopped trying to prove myself to anyone. The only person I had ever needed to prove wrong was myself, that broken girl who walked home trembling on her 25th birthday. And I had done it. Even now, when I walk through Brooklyn or sit in my office high above the city, I carry both pain and pride with me. Pain, because some wounds never fully heal. Pride, because I turned that pain into something stronger. My story is not about revenge alone. It is about resilience, about standing back up after being knocked down, about refusing to let someone else's cruelty define you. And if there is one lesson I carry from it all, it is this: strength does not come from being spared pain. It comes from enduring it, from facing it, and from using it to rise higher than anyone ever thought you could. David never understood that. My parents never understood that. But I do. And that understanding is what sets me free. So when I think back to my 25th birthday, to the champagne glass crashing over my head, I no longer feel small. I no longer feel broken. I feel the weight of what came after. The work, the determination, the victory, and yes, the revenge. It all belongs to me now. It shaped me into the woman I am today. And though revenge gave me a moment of satisfaction, it was resilience that gave me a life.